Excellent. And we are officially live on the gamification revolution. My name is Ivan Kuo, and I'm the managing editor of the gamification.co blog. Today, I will be filling in for Gabe Zuckerman, who is in a foreign country spreading the gospel of gamification. But today, I have a very special guest, and I have Nir of nirinfar.com. Nir, how's it going?
It's great. Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
A- Absolutely, Nir. And Nir, we've had you before on the show about a year ago, and you've also been a GSOM alumnus. Now, the last time I've heard of you, you've talked about something called a desire engine, which is now, I believe, renamed as the hook model. Would you care to tell us more about what this model is?
Sure. Yeah. So the hook model is essentially a framework designed to connect the user's problem to the company's solution with enough frequency to form a habit. That's what it's all about. And so it emerged from about 2.5 years of research around the design patterns that we see endemic to habit forming technologies. So in
Mm,
that span of time, I really took a deep dive into the psychology, into the patterns of what makes certain products habit forming. And what emerged was this four-step process of a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. And that makes up the
right.
hook model.
Cool, cool. And I really like this model. A lot of people seem to reference it often when they talked about user experience and design. And when I tried to initially talk about your model, I had mistakenly called it sort of addictive app design, which you promptly decided to correct me on. So could you elaborate that a little? Don't we want
Sure.
all of our apps to be addictive as possible? What's
I
the
think so,
difference?
so. For some people, it may just be a matter of semantics that there's a specific definition around addiction. Addiction is a compulsive or dependency on a behavior or substance, and addictions, by definition, are self-defeating. Right? They are
Mhm.
always bad by definition. Now, some people kind of play with the word and use it when they don't mean it to be that term, but really, by definition, a habit is what they might be referencing. That a habit can be good or bad, right? We can have good habits, we can have bad habits,
Right.
whereas addictions are always bad for the user. So we don't want to design for addictions because that would mean designing for something that harms our users. However, turns out that the same neural pathways, the same process that creates addictions can also inform how we create habits. And so that's really what compels a lot of my work is helping designers figure out how to create healthy habits. Because, frankly, I think that we are on the precipice of an age where we can create all sorts of habits with our users to help them live better, healthier, happier lives.
Indeed. And by that regard, since you're teaching all these people, do you think we have an ethical responsibility to create things in a responsible manner, not to create these addictive um, applications in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I go into this in further depth in my book. I just published a book a few weeks ago called Hooked: How to Build Habit Forming Products. And in that book, I dedicate a whole chapter called "What Are You Going to Do with This?" And in that chapter, I extensively describe and kind of try to give a framework for how to decide how to use habit forming technology. Because I think,
Mhm.
frankly, the question isn't can you create habit forming technology? I think if you meet a certain bar, it's not a question of if, it's a question of should you even attempt to. Because there is a
Right.
very large ethical component to manipulation. And let's face it,
Sure.
design is about user manipulation, and even more so when we think about the ethical ramifications of designing for habits and potentially addictions if we're not careful, then I think the designer does have a responsibility to ask themselves what's worth them spending their time on. And so I give this framework that I don't want to go into too
Mhm.
much depth here because it requires probably more time than we have. But I create this
I
matrix
have a link
called.
to it over here.
I'm sorry.
I have a link to it for our users to
Oh,
see if they'd like to see sort of a quick graph of that.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, the manipulation matrix. And I kind of put in these four quadrants of uh, how designers can think of themselves and how they might, what role they want to play in users' lives in designing habit forming technology.
Mhm. Fantastic. So yeah, if users want to check that out some more, they can click on this image for that matrix, or you can read the book at uh, hookmodel.com. But so, in looking at that, I wonder if when people design products, specifically in terms of gamification and game design, when people create these products, is there a difference with how sort of gamification designers approach this versus how game designers? Because I know you've had some industry
When
experience
it
with
comes to
games
the
specifically. Have you
when it
observed
comes,
any?
I'm sorry, you broke up there a little bit.
Yes, yes. When it comes to sort of that ethical approach,
Yeah, I
because
don't
some
think so.
people would like to claim as gamification is being manipulative.
Well, I don't think there's necessarily a differentiation between using gamification or actually building within games. I think whenever we are designing, we do need to consider the ethical ramifications of manipulating user behavior. And I don't know if that
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily matter whether it's an actual game we're designing or a gamification experience. I think designers do need to ask themselves these critical questions of uh, not can I, but should I? Right? What kind of behaviors am I changing in users? Because I think we're in an age where manipulation is becoming actually a lot easier to do, and so it's
Indeed.
become kind of a superpower. A reader once wrote to me and said, one trait of a superpower is that it can be used for both good and evil. And so I think if that's the definition, then I think designing for behaviors, designing for habits, can be thought of as a superpower. And so I think no matter if it's gamification on a e-commerce site or within a game or whatever kind of application, I think it's worthwhile to stop and think about what are the potential ramifications. And it turns out not only is that good business, it actually, I'm sorry, not only is it an ethical question, it also turns out to be good for business. That people who fall in this quadrant of being a facilitator, and I define a facilitator as someone who is building something for themselves, building something that they themselves would use, and they believe materially improves people's lives. And what we find is that when design of success.
Hello, everyone. Let's see. Seems that Nir has dropped out of the dreaded spinning circle. Hello, you back?
Hey, my back.
Yes, you are.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure where I got cut off there.
You were talking about just good business
Yeah.
with good design.
That's right. So if we fall into this quadrant of being not only a facilitator that we're building something that we ourselves use and we believe
Mhm.
materially improves people's lives, we find that not only is that a morally good place to be, but it also increases our odds of success.
Indeed. Indeed. I have some more questions for you, but I'd like to just remind everyone who's watching right now, if you'd like to ask questions for Nir or myself, please feel free to sign in through Spreecast and you'll be able to submit your questions either through the chat or even appear on camera if you're feeling great. So, you know, Nir, I believe you have this sort of quadrant of to ensure sort of long-term use and habit forming, there's this X and Y axis you have of sort of perceived usefulness and frequency of use. Personally, for me, my initial reaction to that is that wouldn't a good app simply just improve frequency of use? Is that how it works? But I imagine it's not that simple, is it?
Well, frequency of use on its own isn't enough, right? If there isn't
Right.
enough perceived utility, if it's not far enough on that axis, what I call the habit zone, if it's not far enough inside that habit zone that it crosses that threshold, then frequency
Mhm.
alone doesn't matter. If there's literally zero perceived utility, then that's not going to work.
Right.
However, what's interesting is that it doesn't take very much perceived utility to create a
Mhm.
habit out of a frequent behavior. So all we need is just a little bit of perceived utility. And these behaviors that we do extremely frequently can in fact turn into habits. Because out of the two components of what's really required to form a habit, number one is frequency, and number two is this change in perception of that behavior.
Let's see.
And
But there are a lot of applications out there that are all very useful, and perceived utility is probably great in all of them, but not all of them create habit forming techniques. In your experience, what
That's
sort of determines that?
Yeah, that's the more likely problem. Um,
Yeah.
Most of the time, when I see an app that's struggling, when I meet with a client or when I'm examining a different product's habit forming potential, I will
Hmm.
often find products that have a lot of perceived utility. That the designers have all kinds of things that all kinds of high hopes around what the product is going to do for their users. However,
Hmm.
the behavior doesn't occur frequently enough, and that's pretty common actually. That there just isn't enough interaction or frequency of interaction to drive a habit, because frequency is a very key component of creating new habits. So what do you do then? You may be in trouble, right? There may be a moment of crisis where you figure out, wow, my product is not used frequently enough to form a habit. And from a lot of the research that has been uncovered over the past few years, there seems to be a precipitous drop in the span of about a week's time. So if your product isn't used, if the user isn't doing that key behavior, that habit that you want to see become a long-term behavior, within the span of about a week's time, you may have a problem. Not impossible,
Hmm.
right? There are some products that are not used
Sure.
within a span of a week's time and still create habits, still create unprompted user engagement. It's just very hard to do. Whereas if you think of the products that are most habit forming, you think of Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest.
Ooh, another dropout again. Let's see. Come back to us, Nia.
There we
We
go. Am I
miss you
back?
very much. Yes, you are.
Okay, good. So what we can do about that is to either look for a more frequent behavior, right? Find some point
Hmm.
of interaction, whether it's opening the app, whether it's doing some kind of process of engaging with the product more frequently, or it might be our product doesn't need to form a habit, and that's okay. I mean, my methodology isn't a magic potion that you can sprinkle on top of any product and say, "Aha! Now I'm going to be successful because I'm going to create habits." Plenty of businesses don't need habits, and that's fine. But if your business model does require habits, if you need users to take these actions without conscious thought, right? These unprompted user engagements of opening the app kind of without really thinking about it, kind of like we do with checking email or Twitter or Facebook, this kind of automatic behavior, then you really have to ask yourself whether you have these four key components within the hook model of a trigger, action, reward, and investment, and if the behavior occurs frequently enough.
I see. I see. And we have a question up here from Trevor. Thank you, Trevor, for your question. He asks, well, I hear that, but what about incentivizing frequency using once a day and get a free month to start? Uh, how does the model work into that?
Sorry, I'm not sure. Let me read here. What about incentivizing frequency? Use once a day every day and get a free month to start. Well, um, you know, that those type of techniques might work, and the idea is to kickstart the process by understanding what the product does, and we see this happening a lot with enterprise type products, where to get the user over the hump of paying for the product, here's a free month's use so that you can understand what the product is for, and then the habit is
Yeah.
created. That's great, because there's a high barrier to using a product because there's some kind of monetary hurdle. Um, Incentivizing frequency of use, I'm not opposed to it as long as the rewards are real, right? If there's a reward that all of a sudden ends after a month's time, and that's what users are using the product for, and then that reward abruptly ends, we may find that the engagement also ends. And
Hmm.
so sometimes I see where I see companies using gamification, I think incorrectly, is that they don't think about really what is being solved for the user. What's the real pain point, what I call the internal trigger for why the product is used. And if we don't properly identify that, if we don't properly identify what the itch is to use the product, what's the real need to use the product, and how can we associate our product closely with solving that need, then these kind of solutions are temporary. And users don't build these long term habits around the product's use.
And when you mentioned rewarding here, you mentioned real rewards and that as it relates to internal triggers. How are you defining real in this term?
So internal triggers are what I call these itches, right? This
Mhm.
need. to satisfy typically an emotional need. Now, there's other internal triggers like situations, routines, certain people and places. These are things that when we see these cues in our life or we feel these emotions in our life, we seek to remedy them. It's oftentimes negative emotions. So when we feel bored, what technology do we use? Well, many people go on to ESPN.com, they go onto
Mm.
YouTube. They're seeking to relieve this internal trigger of discomfort that comes from boredom. When we see a moment in our life that we want to capture and we fear losing that moment, well, that's a great time to take out Instagram, and Instagram solves that pain point. There's all these internal triggers in our life that we seek a solution for. So, in order to form these long-term habits and not need to rely on these external triggers of cueing people with messages around their physical environment that tell them what to do, the designer of a habit needs to find what internal trigger they're going to associate with. What are they going to attach to? So that every time the user feels this particular negative emotion, the solution is that product. That's what that reward should satiate. That's what's going to scratch the user's itch.
Very interesting. And when I think about just sort of good design and satiating those itches, I wonder to what extent sort of personal accountability falls into the design and user interaction spectrum. Because I feel like I'm not a designer, but I feel like ideally a product that's perfectly designed can make anyone do anything. That's maybe what some people believe. But obviously, no matter how perfect something is, if someone's lazy, like for instance in a fitness app, and they don't use the app, then it doesn't, succeed. So at what point does sort of that fault lie into the design or just personal accountability of that person willing to change?
Yeah, so I think I maybe disagree with you a little bit in that I don't think that I can at least provide insights on how to get people to do things they don't want to do. That's a tricky one. What I teach and what I want to help companies do is help people do the things they already want to do, and yet there
Okay,
isn't a good solution to help them do it. There are things in the way that make it more difficult for them to do the behavior. So how can we create this hook around doing something that people already want to do? I think it's very, very difficult to get people to do things they actually don't want to do.
right, right. No, I would
That
believe
being
that
said,
too. I
I
just
think
feel
that
like
there's
some proponents of gamification are seeking that. And obviously, that's not always possible, as you're saying.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible, and I don't know if it's actually really ethical. That we want to
Indeed.
find ways to help people be their better selves. That we want to help people live better lives by doing the things they already want to do. And frankly, there is so much opportunity out there, and there will be increasingly over the next few years so many opportunities to help people accomplish things that have previously been very difficult to do will suddenly become
Mhm.
much easier to do because of where technology is going, right? We know that
Sure.
as technology evolved from desktops to laptops to now these little things, and then soon wearable technologies, there will be so many new opportunities to trigger people to help them do behaviors that previously were too difficult to accomplish, and that's
Yeah.
that's really exciting. I'm really looking forward to that feature.
Yeah. I want to tap into this thing about emerging technologies because with the advent of the iPhone and touchscreen mobile screens, I feel like that's changed a lot of how we interact with devices. Do you have any insight as to sort of how design has evolved with this touch mechanism? Does being able to touch our user interfaces increase our sort of affection for these things and create better habits because we're able to physically touch things?
Hmm, that's interesting. I don't have specific insights on what that does to our emotion level, but I will say that I think it the responsiveness of how quickly users can go through these four steps of the hook model from trigger, action, reward to investment has increased. And anytime a technology can find a way to either send users through that hook model more frequently or to make that reward phase more rewarding, for example, right, to make it
Sure.
higher perceived utility, we're going to get a faster habit formation process. So either quick cycles or more frequent cycles increase the likelihood of a habit being formed. And so, of course, when I've got this little device with me at all times, there's all kinds of ways to trigger me, to provide easier actions, to provide more rewarding rewards, and allow me to make these quick investments in the product which all lead to changing my preference for that behavior.
Indeed. And by that regard, I want to jump even further into the future. Things like technologies like the Oculus Rift are sort of attempting to bring, virtual reality into the home. So as that's becoming more available for, consumers to use, do you perceive that sort of even bring that gap even lower with sort of being able to interact with things and seeing rewards happen even quicker?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think all sorts of behaviors today that are too difficult to do because there is no trigger for that immediate action will in the future become much easier to change those behaviors. So, for example, if you think about what is it now, 5.5 years ago, the Apple App Store didn't exist. I mean, think
Right.
about that, right? We all remember 5.5 years ago. That wasn't that long ago. And think about all
Mhm.
the behaviors that today are triggered, that are part of our everyday lives, that we do without even conscious thought. We're constantly, doing these behaviors that we didn't do 5 years ago. So, what are the
Yeah.
next 5 years going to bring? Right? What happens when we have wearable technologies like Google Glass? Will that go mainstream? Or smartwatches or biometric
Mhm.
devices? What happens when we can instantly provide feedback for all these different measures? What's going to happen is that we're going to become, hopefully, smarter about our day-to-day actions, that we start to build different habits enabled from the ability to trigger people at specific moments that we currently can't do.
Sure. And it's funny because as these mobile technologies are emerging, we're able to do more in a digital world, but our physical bodies are shriveling so down, especially as virtual reality gets better, people are moving less and less. I find it fascinating how people like if I'm just people watching in public transport, the most idle action people are doing is just in their phones. And it's just people are talking less and reading less and just all on their phones instead. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the reason I do the work I do is twofold. One, I want to help companies build healthy habits. Right, I think there's a lot of potential out
Yes.
there to help people live better, healthier, happier lives by forming healthy habits. And I think we're gonna see some great things happening over the next decade by using technology for good. The other side of why I do what I do is that it's only by understanding what's going on that we can do something about it. Sometimes every once in a while I'll get somebody that
Sure.
reads my book or reads my blog and says, "Hey, you're teaching people how to make the atomic bomb here, right? You're teaching people how to addict others." And you know, I kind of that comment always takes me back a little bit because if you look at what I write about, 50% of what I write about is how to build healthy habits, and the other half is how to resist being manipulated by these technologies. Because it's only by
Indeed.
understanding what's happening to us. It's only by understanding, what makes Twitter so compelling. Why am I always on email? Why am I always checking my device mindlessly? That we can do something about it. And in fact, in my
Right.
own life, I've done that quite a bit. I've actually used the hook model to get into better shape, to improve my relationship with my family, to use technology less at certain times in my life when I thought that I was using it too much. For example, I wrote an article, maybe someone can post a link here, called Strange Sex Habits of Silicon Valley, which was all about how technology is maybe entering the bedroom a little too much when it comes to people who are very tech savvy. That, many of
Yeah.
us, we use our devices so often that we forget to pay attention to the person who's right next to us. And so, what I did in my own home was I actually bought a $6 timer, connected it to my router, so that at 10 p.m. every night, the internet
Yeah.
shuts off,
That's great.
right? So, and why did I do that? Because I recognize that the 4 steps of the hook model required breaking one of those steps so that I can't do that behavior, right? The internet is infinitely variable. There's always something interesting to go exploring. And so that process between the trigger and the action had to be broken for me to stop that key
Mhm.
behavior.
I love that. And thank you to Beth Case. She posted a link to that article right below if you want to read more about the strange sex habits of Silicon Valley. It's a fantastic title. Fantastic
Thank you.
title.
Thanks, Beth, for posting that.
And we have another question from Michael Finney, who's the main man who got you on the show today. Michael asks, what does Nir tap into in order to stay on top of new technology and business challenges that hook model can users solve? What are you reading these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. And talk about habits. Wow. I mean, I have to constantly juggle this struggle of uh, being conscious of my information diet. It's a challenge that I think there's so much to get out of the web these days, and there's so much interesting stuff happening. So many fantastic people are writing about trends related to what I work on and what I research, and I
Mhm.
frankly have to be very conscious of that consumption. So I don't think what I'm reading is actually that important because you can very quickly find the best content, right? There's all kinds of curated sites today.
Sure.
My good friend Ryan Hoover just started a company called Product Hunt that elevates some great products through a crowd curation platform, following the right people on Twitter, and you're going to get tons of information. What I struggle
Yeah.
with is not so much where to find the information, but how to consume it better, how to consume it consciously. And so one
Indeed.
tool that I've actually come to find is very habit forming is Pocket. And so I have a rule that
I
I
was just
don't
going to mention that.
consume. Okay, so you might be hooked as well. So I don't
Yeah.
I as a rule I don't consume any articles, and maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot here because I want people to read my blog, but I don't read any articles online. I don't do that. So while
Right.
I'm on the web, I'm either checking email, I'm writing, I'm doing something productive. I'm not sitting there reading articles. Why? Because I found that when I was reading an article, there were all these triggers that prompted an action of clicking that article. The variable reward is
Mhm.
what's going to be behind that article. And then the investment is getting the information and maybe sending it to somebody. And I didn't want to have that hook happen all the time because I would start reading, I'd start reading on TechCrunch and
Infinitely.
then go one layer deeper and one layer deeper. And then an hour later, I just, spent all this time when I should have been working on something else. So,
Right.
instead, Pocket is my new solution to send all the articles I'm reading to my phone. And then I can only read those articles, or in my case, I often listen to those articles while I'm working out. That's when I consume
Right.
most of the content of the latest news. And then, I do
That's
read
wonderful.
quite a bit of academic journals, so that's my one exception. If it's an academic journal, then I will. That's a lot harder to listen to, so I have to actually read those online.
Yeah. Yeah. I personally use Get Pocket too. I agree. It's a wonderful tool. Except I sometimes run into the problem where it's like I ended up seeing all these triggers and I just end up adding a ton of content to my pocket
Yeah, yeah,
that I just have this problem of just
that's
keeping
actually
up with
really
on my
interesting.
own.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Pocket got I actually talked to the Pocket folks about this. They've gotten so good at
Mhm.
creating that habit of saving, 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 saving that now they have this other problem of people have so much
Yeah.
saved and they don't know how to process through it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll give you two quick tips real quick. There's these two apps that I
Sure.
actually use to get through my queue. One is
Uh-huh.
called Read Time. There's an app called Read Time where you can dial in how much time you have, and I'll show you on the you can
See.
dial in, see how much time you have, and you can say, give me a pocket
Ah,
article that's only going to take me 6 minutes. So if you have that amount of time,
that's
you
cool.
can crank through an article. And the other
That's
app
great.
is called Lisgo, Lisgo, which reads to you, at least on iPhone, read the articles to you. So when you're in the car, when you're working out, that's what I do. I listen to articles while I'm working out, and I can crank through, 10, 15, 20 articles in a workout.
That's awesome. Yeah, that I'm going to use ReadTime because one of my favorite sort of aspects of the Kindle e-reader is the ability for it to tell you how much time is left in the chapter. That little bit
Yeah.
of info, I think, really helps a lot. And I think I'll use something like ReadTime to get through those millions of articles I have saved.
Yep. Yep. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we're running out of time here. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the things you have coming up near.
Sure.
Michael Finney asks again, he'd like to know sort of if anyone wants to keep up with your hook and model, if there's a community for that where people can go to, and sort of tell us more about what you have coming up in the future.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, just launched the book, and that's been keeping me pretty busy these days. I'm going to start working on another book pretty soon here around this same topic for a wider
Mhm.
audience. The hooked book was really for people who are designing products. So the next book
Right.
is going to be more for a wider audience, people trying to understand their technology habits. We also have coming up the first ever, I just announced yesterday, the Habit Summit. So if you go to habitsummit.com, that will
Great.
be oh, thanks for posting the link there. That's going to be a
Yep.
collection of authors and experts and practitioners talking about how to form user habits and personal habits, and how we can use that to improve our lives and the lives of others. And in terms of a community, that's a great question. Actually, I would love some help if anybody has an ideas around how to
Mhm.
form a community of like-minded people. Maybe Michael wants to take up the task here. I'd be happy to help and contribute
Yeah.
around
Book
that job.
evangelist.
Yeah.
Great. When can we find the Habit Summit? When's that going to happen?
Oh, March 25th, and it's
March
going to
25th.
be at
Awesome.
Stanford. Yeah, and the early bird tickets are on sale until February 1st.
Cool. Cool. And that's a good segue. If you like Nir's Habit Summit and like-minded content, we too are also having a G Summit conference that Nir has spoken at before. You can find that more info at gsummit.com. That will be happening from this early in June. And for all of us who've come here at the Gamification Revolution, we're out of time once again. 30 minutes passes by so quickly. Nir, I'd like to thank you for coming on and sharing us everything you have with your expertise.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah. And for everyone out here, thanks for coming again. We'll be back next week, and we have some great content coming up soon, including Brian Burke of Gartner to talk about his gamification analytics. So, as for now, keep having fun, everyone, and I'll see y'all soon. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye bye.